valley, from dusk to dawn, Grandma worked the land like a buzzing honeybee, pausing only to take a sip of water and break to eat once a day. When I was 3 to about 10 years old, I lived in a rainforest. The valley is called Mapumana. The natural wonders all around filled me with serenity. The monkeys and tropical birds called out from trees, tangled in vines. The land possessed richness in soil and nutrients. Ripe fruits and nuts fell to the ground. At that time, our farmland was surrounded by thick, deep jungle, far removed from the mainstream and modern society. Nearly every other weekend, the adults left the valley to head back to the village. My Dawn, grandma, stayed behind to tend the crops and care for the young ones, 3 of us. I had never been outside of the valley, except to travel between the village and the farmland. A day-and-a-half walk. I followed my grandmother closely. She knew how to survive off the land. I knew as a young child, as long as we were with grandma, we wouldn't go hungry, because she always knew where to find wild yams, mushrooms, edible greens, fish, and prawns. Her nails were like obsidian. She spent many decades of her life foraging in the wilderness. She grew cotton that she spun, dyed, weaved, and made into clothes. Grandma was fierce, stubborn, and wise. In her lifetime, she endured indescribable heartbreak. One day at the farmland with Grandma, when the other adults were no longer present, a stranger emerged from the other side. He drove a motorbike. The stranger, who was slim-built, average height, and appeared to be in his early 30s, entered our land without an invitation. This man quickly realized that we were alone and was unintimidated by 3 small children and an old grandma. He seized the opportunity to pick all of his favorite fruits and vegetables from our farmland. Grandma spotted him from our hut as he climbed the papaya tree. He picked the best and golden colored ones. She cursed him. Bet you, it meant, pick it all, you monkey. We stood side by side, holding our hands, pointing at the guy as he completely ignored us. The man selected the most voluptuous squash, cucumbers, corn, melons, and eggplants. He harvested 3 solid bags full, one dangling from each side of the bike with the other on top of the seat. He tied the bags tightly with thick black rubber bands to prevent them from falling off, so he wouldn't lose what he had stolen. The man's face bore no shame or guilt, like we didn't exist. 3 days later, my aunt and uncle, siblings and cousins returned from the village. They brought back salt crystals, dried fish, peppermint candy, and brown sugar cane panela, which we called bain-e-ase, literal translation, horseshit candy, as a treat. Everybody learned about the theft. In order to make light of the situation, my siblings shared a memory of Grandma and another attempted thief. Back in Grandma's old village in Buon Taprong, she caught a Vietnamese man suspended mid-air in the treetop stealing ripe papayas. That time, Grandma had acted quickly. She grabbed the longest bamboo tree branch nearby and repeatedly poked him. Everyone chuckled at the retelling, especially my older sisters. They laughed so hard that they were in tears. Some even peed in their pants. Each of them took turns reciting Grandma's threats as she yelled at the thief in broken Vietnamese. Xuống la, kung xuống câu drop bằng e, which literally meant, come down. Don't come down, I'll poke your butthole. That day, she made a grown man cry. He begged her to let him go and promised to never return. To this day, that memory is how we remember Grandma. In Mapumana Valley, the 3 of us were all small children, and my grandma couldn't do anything but watch. Grandma got very upset, but she didn't grab a stick to poke at his real end. Unfortunately, what we all witnessed that day wasn't the first, nor it be the last time the Vietnamese stole from us. The next time around, the intruders wanted more than our precious crops. They threatened our families' lives so that they could claim ownership of the land. On 2 consecutive occasions, our hut was burnt down to the ground. Each of those times, my families regrouped to find new materials to rebuild our tiny home. On the 3rd time, the invaders sent us a clear message: leave or die. We relocated to a village near the army base where my aunt and uncle lived. Our family searched for more farmland. I was 9 years old in 1995. More people from the north moved to the valley and cut down the diverse forests to plant monoculture crops. We watched the thick jungle disappear. Grandma lived in the jungle for as long as she could, never adapting to village life. I eventually escaped Vietnam as a teenager and immigrated to the United States at 16. I received word that my grandma had passed while I was still in the refugee camp. I have so many memories from those days, my childhood in Vietnam, the struggles and poverty that we experienced. It's been nearly 2 decades since the refugee camp. Now I am 35 years old and still putting puzzle pieces together to learn about my roots. From a young age, I was curious about our family's stories. When I was 10, I stumbled upon photos in an old trunk in my aunt's room that contained photographs from the war. I didn't recognize anyone in the picture, but one stood out who looked like my family. I asked my oldest brother, Ipoe, about the young man in the photo. That was how I first learned about our uncle who fought in guerrilla warfare and died when he was just a teenager. Ipoe told a story about that day that he could never forget. When I was a young boy, our two cousins and I would bring rice, dried fish, and venison to the man in the forest. These men were the unspoken and unseen army, aka Full Row Fighters, United Front for the Liberation of Oppressed Races. Years later, my brother can still recall that day so vividly. After many hours of walking through the jungle, they arrived at their usual destination. Unexpectedly, they were not alone when they reached the Full Row Fighters. There were soldiers with guns and grenades, a whole platoon of men in leafy green uniforms arriving at the exact same location. The enemies had been searching for the forest fighters. Without a shadow of doubt, someone had leaked their location. Ipoer and the cousins hid as my teenage uncle and his men were ambushed by the Viet Cong. Bullets began to fly. They were outnumbered. When the Full Row soldiers attempted to flee, my uncle didn't. He was trapped and stood his ground. He fired back at the enemies with a hand pistol, his only weapon. He ran out of bullets. A Viet Cong soldier pulled a trigger and shot right through his skull. My brother, as a young child, silently hid behind the bush as he witnessed the bloody terror. He described the scene. I saw Uncle drop to the ground. My knees wouldn't stop trembling. He whispered to the cousins, "Iran! Iran!" He meant, "Run! Run!" Shocked and horrified, they quickly ran back to the village to alert our family. The very next morning, the Viet Cong tied Uncle's hands and legs with ropes and carried his body hung from a log, parading him around the village for everyone to see. His uniform, dark green and black with a hint of white, was torn to pieces. They mutilated his body and announced through a megaphone to every villager, "Come see, we've caught a wild boar." The villagers and my family were horrified and began to sob. One of my older sisters, Jen, described the scene. "I was about 10 years old when I watched his head dangle from the log. The enemy yelled, 'Im lặng! Không ai được khóc!' Silent. No one is allowed to cry." The consequences of being a member of the Full Row Fighters was not only death but mutilation. They forbid a proper burial. Instead, the Viet Cong forced bystanders to dig a hole. They dumped his body onto shattered pieces of broken glass. My grandmother, mother, and father, brothers and sisters were forced to witness and not shed a tear. Grandma never opened up about what she suffered that day or any other. To bear witness to the death of her young son isn't something that anyone can forget or heal from. Perhaps she found comfort in sowing seeds of life through weaving fabric, foraging for wild edibles, and growing food. What I knew of my grandma was being nurtured and cared for when I was just a young child without parents. She offered what protection she could, but the forces of destruction in our lives were devastating. We inherited the painful history of our people being stripped of our land, of war, poverty, and oppression. She suffered so greatly and gave so much. She knew how to survive. To this day, my biggest regret is that I had to leave her without saying goodbye. In my mind, I revisit the jungle of my childhood, and Grandma lives on. To me, she is a tree of wisdom. Her hands were always busy, working the soil, tending plants, animals, and children. Her thick calluses hardened like porcelain and left her fingertips blurred without prints. At night, she gently ran her fingers through our hair until we fell asleep. For my family, even in our dreams, the valley is lost forever.